This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. So good to have you all with us. Another exciting episode. Richard, it's good to see you.
Always good to see you, Sam.
We do this every once in a while.
Yeah.
We make no attempts to be regular in our
Let's not get too personal here,
yeah.
Sam.
In our attempts to do these biographies, and something that we love and we know that our listeners love, but we like to dive into these leaders, past and present, mostly past though, I think.
Yeah.
In fact, I think they're all past, but we'll maybe eventually get to a contemporary leader. But this week we're looking at Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah. And
an OG.
And I actually was up speaking in Wisconsin this past week, and ran into one of our listeners, Mark Millman. I'll give a shout out to him. And he was plugging the podcast, and it was all caught up, and he mentioned how much he enjoyed the biography. So Mark, thanks for that. That inspired me to come back and pull a biography off my shelf and make sure that we didn't get any farther behind on those. So
good. Well,
I always love running into listeners and that identify themselves and then plug the podcast in front of a whole audience.
Yeah, listeners that appreciate it too.
Yeah, we'd like those.
That's an extra bonus. Well, I'll refrain from any cheese jokes about Wisconsin, and we'll just move right along here with the biography of Jonathan Edwards. Why don't you first tell us what's your source material you're pulling from here?
Yeah, well, I've got two biographies actually that I have on him. One is by Iain Murray called Jonathan Edwards, a new biography, and I read that one first, and it's pretty good. Iain Murray has done a couple of books like that, biographies, and then after that, I read one by George Marsden and on Jonathan Edwards, A Life. And that's the one I really kind of based a lot of this out on. I think this one came out in about 2003. George Marsden is a highly esteemed historian, and so kind of had to read that when that came out. And Edwards is, of course, like all these biographies, a complex individual. We just haven't found one yet that has his act all together in every part of his life. Mm-hmm. You know, there's always flaws, there's always struggles, there's always a past, there's a strained relationship with a father, there's just stuff that people have to overcome.
Yeah.
And I as I've shared before, I like that because it tells me that you don't just become a great leader simply if you're lucky enough to be born into a life that doesn't have a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Typically, great leaders have to overcome all kinds of adversity. It's never just straightforward.
Yeah.
There's always nagging issues that they might struggle with their whole life, but they manage to overcome those, at least long enough to be able to make a significant contribution.
Well, you know, and I think we often get the Sunday school version of a lot of these leaders.
Yeah.
You know, it's like they did this, you know, Edward, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And okay, he's a great preacher or whatever. And the reality is much more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, several things about Edwards. One, he's born in 1703. And, Sam, when you hear 1703, who else immediately comes to mind that was born in that year?
Oh, well, I'd have to say Washington for sure.
Well, don't be too sure. Actually, I read an interesting study one time.
Significant people. That was a very pivotal year.
Significant year
for births.
Yeah. Well,
many people were born that year.
You know, it's interesting because around that time there was a lot of kind of very secular philosophical views that were being promoted by some people that were not Christians, and there were a lot of people in the church going into the 18th century that were quite concerned about young people and the drift away from biblical teaching and lifestyles and so on. And then in 1703, three interesting people are born. One is Edwards, who of course is going to be a part of the Great Awakening, first Great Awakening in America. Another person born also in 1703 is Gilbert Tennant, who is going to be a Presbyterian minister in America that will be also very involved in the First Great Awakening. And he will be along with Edwards, two of the giants in the First Great Awakening in America. And then also in 1703, John Wesley is born. And he's going to start the whole Wesleyan revival in England. And so, in 1703, you've got three babies crawling around in the church nursery, and all the adults are worried about what's happening with the young people. And they have no idea that three giants of revival and spiritual awakening have been born and are destined to have a huge impact on America and Britain. And of course, Whitefield a couple years later after that. And so it's always interesting to me, especially when you see several of these people born the same year, same age, all with a heart for revival. And so Edwards is one of those, and he comes from a line of ministers. His father is a minister. His father-in-law and his grandfather is a dominant minister. A lot of ministers up his family tree and down his family tree. In fact, Edwards, they've traced his lineage. He had about 11 kids, and through his direct heirs, there were several vice presidents, well, at least one vice president of America. Actually, Aaron Burr, who kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel, was Edwards' grandson. And a bunch of college presidents of Princeton and other places, lots of congressmen and government leaders. There's been studies of just the descendants, the lineage that comes out of Edwards. And there's just something to be said, I think, of a spiritual legacy. When, of course, Edwards, with his 11 kids, they would have devotions at every meal, not just at breakfast or dinner, but every meal they sat down. He would have devotions with them, and he agonized over the walk with God that each of his children had. In fact, he had George Whitefield, probably the greatest preacher of that day, stay at his home, and he would have Whitefield talk to his daughters to help make sure that they were all saved. And so Edwards is a scholar with very high standards. His father was one of these guys that just had the strictest of standards for his own personal conduct, for his son's conduct. And as a minister, he expected that Christians would behave in a certain way and very high standards. And that created something of a conflict for Edwards, because he adopted that in his own lifestyle. He was a very, very disciplined person. He would typically, on a typical day, would spend about 13 hours a day in his study, just reading, studying, writing. He felt like the most important thing he could do for his people and his church was to present the best presentation and teaching of truth and insight. And so his wife, Sarah, basically kind of ran the farm and took care of all the kids. And but he was very disciplined. So like every day he would spend an hour each day just playing with his kids. And he had 11, so he had to kind of spread it around. But
we get to devote much time to each.
Yeah. But obviously they adored him, and he was very close to them. And Edwards was, in many ways, he was awkward around people. He led with his mind. He led with his insight, and could have made a great lawyer. He would, in his sermons, of course, maybe the most famous sermon preached in America is "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which he preached in a meeting in Enfield at a certain point, trying to stir up revival. And but Edwards was bookish, scholarly, academic. George Whitefield was a born actor. He was very dramatic and had a very powerful voice and appealed to emotion. Whitefield would at some point weep in just about every one of his sermons. Edwards tended to stay close to his manuscript. He didn't necessarily read all of his sermons, but he typically for years had a manuscript that he tried to stay pretty close to, because he presented a very sort of a compelling argument. If you listen to Edwards preach, I mean, he just step by step, just logically demolished all of your objections and presented an overwhelming case for why you needed to believe this or do that. And so he didn't have a real strong voice. He wasn't really a strong person physically. He just sat at his desk all the time and read and studied. And so, but he could build a case. And that particular sermon, when he starts talking about that basically it's only by the grace of God that we're not all in hell right now, and that it's God's grace and mercy that keeps us there long enough for us to come to a decision and choose Him and experience salvation. And so the interesting thing is that he kind of builds that case, and what he's trying to say is God and His grace. He's trying to be positive. He's trying to get his listeners to the point where they realize, oh, well, I'm so fortunate that God has mercifully kept me around this long and given me a chance to make a wise decision. But when he preached that sermon the first time, people just came unglued. They began weeping and howling and falling to the ground, sobbing in fear of their impending judgment. And he never finished the sermon. I don't think he ever got to the positive part because they were so overwhelmed by what stood before them. And so, but Edwards was one of these guys. The big problem back before the First Great Awakening was that he was a Congregationalist, and they had, the different denominations all wrestled with what to do with baptism. Of course, the Catholic Church baptized babies, and that was considered part of how you gave grace to people. The first way was by baptizing babies, and then by participating in all 7 of the sacraments, as they called them. God would give His grace to you. But when the different Protestant denominations began, each one had to say, well, what does baptism mean, and so on, and how do you know when you're actually born again? In the Catholic Church, just once you were inside the church, you were saved. But the Congregationalists realized, well, no, you could theoretically be a church member and not be born again. They were very Calvinistic and said, you have to be elect. God has to have chosen you, and if He hasn't, then there's nothing you can do to elect yourself. And so even Edwards, his father had very strict standards to say, how do you know if someone is actually a Christian or not? What's the evidence? And that was the big debate. When you were a baby, you were baptized, but you live like the devil now. So there's no evidence that you're elect, that you're chosen. And so Edwards' father had a very tough standard to say, no, if you're a child of God, if you're of the elect, you're going to act in a holy manner and a holy lifestyle and so on. And so Edwards ultimately kind of adopted that. Interestingly, his grandfather, Stoddard, was pastoring one of the most prominent churches in Massachusetts, in Northampton, and he was a much more popular kind of speaker, preacher, and they all had this problem because in the Congregational church, you would be baptized as a baby, but then when you became an adult, you would be admitted in as a church member, and so the big dilemma was, well, some of these people were baptized, but they don't act very Christian, and now they want to be a church member, and should we let them in? I mean, how do we decide? Who are we to say whether God has chosen them or not? Is there not any fruit or evidence of that? And so Edward's grandfather had basically kind of said, well, let's just, at least if we let them join the church and take communion, they'll be exposed to the gospel even more, and they'll be around the grace of God, and that'll be good for them. And so he kind of lightened the standard. But Edwards, in his upbringing, was, no, you should tighten the standard. So interestingly, Stoddard ultimately brought Edwards on to be his associate when his grandfather was in his 80s. And once he died, Edwards was called to be the pastor. And so in his most famous pastorate, he takes over for a grandfather that was pretty loosey-goosey on some of the standards, and now Edwards wants to tighten them up. And so that's going to be very interesting. It led to a couple of revivals, the First Great Awakening, and interestingly enough, it begins with young people. And we've talked about this before, how a lot of the revivals in world history tend to start with young people, not old people. And a couple of young people connected to their youth and to the youth of that city died suddenly. Just, very, very inexplicably. In one case, a young person just dies, and it shocks all the young people, and they realize how tenuous life is. And so a revival begins among them, in which hundreds of young people ultimately join the church. And so with Edwards, what's going to happen is that there's going to be seasons of revival, kind of like a harvest time, where there might have been, like, he might have gone 3 years and not had one person join the church. And then all of a sudden there'll be this movement of the Spirit of God, and all of a sudden there'll be hundreds of people joining in. And so Edwards has seen this, and he basically begins to think that the revivals are the harvest times. And so you just keep preaching and teaching, but you wait for the breakthrough times when they come. And so he's going to experience a couple of those. The First Great Awakening, of course, is quite famous. The first real awakening to take place back in about 1730s and 40s. There'll be another revival that happens in the 1740s. And it's interesting, most of the Great Awakenings revivals will happen within a generation of a major war, like the Revolutionary War or the Civil War or World War I. They all tend to happen within a generation. So many of the converts of an awakening end up dying on a battlefield. But Edwards begins to write about what he observes, and he gets criticized because, of course, there's people that see people wailing, and of course these people were very Calvinistic, and so the Calvinist theology said that God elects some to salvation and not others. And so if you're not elect, it doesn't matter. And you may really want to be saved. You might really want to be a Christian. But if you haven't been chosen, there's nothing you can do to be saved. Your name's not in the book. And so some of these people would be terribly convicted of their sin, and they would want to be forgiven of their sin, but they would have no peace. And they assume that must mean I'm not elect, I'm destined to hell, and there's not a thing I can do about it. And sometimes there would even be a wave of suicides afterward, where people would be so distraught that they were headed to hell that they would kill themselves. And so Edwards is trying to write to people to say, well, how can you tell if someone is actually born again, and what's the evidence, and what's the evidence of true revival? And some of the things he writes become Christian classics that will be read around the world by Christian leaders, because he sits in the front row and sees what real revival and awakening looks like. And of course, he gets criticized for all the excesses and the emotionalism, and he's not that emotional of a guy himself, and so he'll write and say, well, I mean, falling on the ground and wailing at the top of your lungs is not evidence that you've been saved. That's emotionalism. But a transformed character, a godliness, obedience to God's word. He's trying to identify, how can you know if someone truly is converted or revived? And some of his observations, even hundreds of years later, still are read and studied. And he's a Puritan, and Puritans had a way of just analyzing things, I would say to death, but I mean, they dug deep, and they really thought about stuff. And a lot of it is quite practical. A lot of it is how do we live? And so, by his writing, by his preaching, especially sinners in the hands of an angry God, by his descendants that go into politics and into all kinds of different leadership roles, by his friendship with people like George Whitefield, And also David Brainerd, who became a very famous missionary to the Indians. He dies at a young age. But as he's quite sick and dying of exposure and so on from his harsh travels, he spends quite a bit of time at the Edwards house. And Jonathan Edwards actually writes a little biography about him afterward that is used to inspire missionaries for years and years afterward, about being inspired by this godly young man that gave his life for the cause of Christ. So he is a person that just in many different ways exerts a huge influence. And we've said this before, but one of the greatest ways you can influence people is through your thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I always encourage leaders, hey, put your whatever God's teaching you, be sure you put it down in writing, whether it's just a tweet, a blog, or a book. But don't just keep it to yourself. Don't just keep it to your direct reports. Whatever it is that God's teaching you, get it out there in a way that can be widespread, because in the long run, that may have a bigger, broader influence than just the organization that you led directly yourself.
Richard and Daniel Blackaby will be at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove on May 17th through 19th, 2021. The title of this event is On the Move, How God Increases Your Spiritual Influence. You can find out more and register at thecove.org. Links will also be in the show notes. Well, Richard, it's always fascinating looking at these leaders from history and kind of seeing them in their context and seeing what's going on around them and how they lead in difficulty and different circumstances. And Edwards is really no different than a lot of the leaders we've looked at before. So maybe in the time we have left here, why don't you just unpack a little bit of his career that takes a turn that, maybe we wouldn't expect. Like, he's doing well, he's preaching, he's teaching, he's writing, he's thinking a lot, and things are happening. And
you would think if you were in his church, you'd think, wow, we've got this world-famous pastor, religious leaders around the world admire him. He's a friend of George Whitefield and people like that. But he begins to just feel very conscientious about his flock and to say, as their pastor, I've got to make sure that they are born again. And if we admit someone into the church membership, we need to make sure that we know that they are a born-again church member. So he actually goes for a period where there's maybe 3 years, where nobody applies to join the church. And then finally he has someone that applies. And so now Edwards is ready to give this guy a test to say, well, before we just automatically accept you into membership, here's some questions I have for your conduct, your lifestyle, your obedience to God's commands, and so on. And if you enthusiastically embrace this kind of godly lifestyle, well, then clearly you're of the elect. Well, one of Edwards' problems, which is a challenge for a lot of leaders, is a lot of leaders have a high standard for themselves. They may be very driven, very task-oriented, very ambitious, goal-oriented. And the problem sometimes is that they put their personal standards as the standard for everybody else. Mm-hmm. And so people just aren't going to measure up. A lot of them are just not wired the way the leader is. And so Edwards basically takes and says, well, if I were living this way, which I strive to do, then that would convince me that I was saved. So who else is as godly as I am and as serious about God as I am? And he puts that standard up against the first applicant to the church membership in over 3 years. And the guy turns it down and says, I can't live like that. Even Jesus wasn't that holy. And so this becomes a cause for some enemies of his in the church to rise up and say, he's just so demanding and he has unrealistic expectations for people and he's just judgmental and nobody's perfect. And one thing leads to another until finally the church gets to the place of actually having a vote whether to dismiss Edwards or not. And they do. They vote to basically to fire him. And Edwards is one of these guys, you look back later and you realize he's one of the greatest minds to come out of the 18th century America. But at the time, as so often happens with leaders, the people that lived with him at the time didn't appreciate what they had. Yeah. They don't realize that this guy's brilliant, and we're so fortunate to be preached to every week by someone that knows God's word and studies it so thoroughly. And so he gets fired. And the interesting thing is there's a couple of people in particular that really led in that. And it's clear that they just were done with him and wanted him out. And one of Edwards' problems is that he's just he's just sort of an aloof, private, bookish kind of academic pastor. And he's awkward around people. I mean, not around his own family, but he's not big into small talk and doesn't know how just to joke around. It's all serious with him. And so people don't necessarily, I mean, he had some very close friends, but even George Whitefield, it's funny, George Whitefield admired him and respected his intelligence, his godliness. But Marsden says that Whitefield actually got much closer to Benjamin Franklin, who wasn't even a Christian, was a deist. But they rode frequently and enjoyed each other's company. Whereas Whitefield, Edwards at one point took Whitefield aside and kind of corrected him on a few things he thought were a little excessive and ought to show a bit more moderation. And he said, I wasn't sure Whitefield was all that receptive to my counsel to him. And Edwards probably had a point, but he just came across a little preachy. Yeah. And so Whitefield admired him, but he just wasn't the kind of guy you got very close to. And which says, as a leader, there's just times where it's not enough just to, casting the vision and driving performance. There's just a certain point you got to let your hair down and just have fun with your peeps, and just be with them and enjoy them. And Edwards couldn't do that. And so eventually he actually gets fired. And the guy that really pushed it later will write a letter after Edwards' death, he'll write a letter and say that he was wrong, that Edwards did not deserve to be fired, that they acted unkindly and ridiculously, and they'll admit that they were wrong. But by then Edwards is gone and dead. And so interestingly, Edwards is relieved of being pastor, but they still ask him to do pulpit supply for the next almost a year. He's filling in, preaching in a church that just fired him. It's just unusual.
That's got to be an awkward year.
Yeah, and I think he's still in the parsonage for a while until they get another pastor. And Edwards often was broke, and so he's got 11 kids, so I think he preached because he needed the money,
Yeah.
And but a lot of the people that fired him, and they wouldn't even come here and preach. And so finally they make a motion saying, we can't have him preach anymore. We fired him. We need to cut ties with him. And so he immediately gets offers around the world. There's a church in Scotland that would love to have him come and be their pastor. There's churches in Virginia extend a call. But for various reasons, he ends up taking a church out where the Native American Indians are, and it's wild frontier. It's Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and literally they are right on the frontier. A bunch of Mohican Indians and others around there, and there's fears of uprisings, and they actually have to stockade even the house that Edwards lives in as a basically a defensive fort if they need it to be. And his daughters are worried about him living out there where they could be ambushed and killed. And I mean, it's very rough. For about 6-7 years, he's out there. And everyone is thinking, this is this scholarly guy. He'll go from there to becoming the president of Princeton University. But he's out there worrying about being, murdered in his sleep by marauding Native Indian bands. And and he has to preach now through an interpreter to the Indians, and so it's very, very primitive. You just never think someone part of the First Great Awakening. Now he's reduced to mission work on the wild frontier, but for about 7 years he's there. But of course, because he's out in the frontier, away from civilization, he's got time to write and time to think, and he kind of enjoys that. And he ends up writing several of his best books. Most thoughtful books. It's interesting. What you would look at, like Satan kind of had a victory with him, ends up putting him in a place where he's got time now to write some of his best stuff. And so eventually his son-in-law is the president of Princeton, and he dies prematurely. His son-in-law married to one of his daughters. And so Princeton approaches him and says, would you take your son-in-law's place and become president of Princeton? And so he ultimately takes that on, which is really a perfect kind of job for him. He's suited, certainly in terms of the academics and so on, and investing in the students. And he gets there, and Edwards has always been really interested in science and so on, and advances in medicine and other things. And so they're kind of promoting smallpox vaccinations at the time. And he wants to set an example for all the students that you don't need to be afraid of vaccines and so on. And so he and his family goes down and gets the vaccine. Well, his wife and kids recover from it fairly quickly, but he actually developed smallpox as a result of the vaccine and dies from it a week or so later.
Wow.
And so sadly, and again, it's not that he had smallpox, it's he gets it from the vaccine and dies from the very thing that he's taking to prevent himself from getting it, of course, the irony of all that. And so he dies at a relatively young age. He's only 54 years old. Never in great health. But again, you look at a guy in so many ways. He had so many quirks about him. Super disciplined and spiritual in some ways. You look at and say, how could this guy ever really be much of a leader? Gets fired from the one church that he really pastored and knew well. You look at the trajectory of his life and say, kind of a disappointing life in some ways. And yet he leaves behind a body of some of the most brilliant thought to come out of 18th century America. It's still impressive to this day. And a famous sermon, and to be a spark plug of the First Great Awakening. Certainly no small feat for any person. And so again, a person coming out of America, a lot of people have said that Benjamin Franklin kind of symbolizes the pre-revolutionary America, but in many ways, Jonathan Edwards does. And you have to ask yourself, why did America become such a hotbed of evangelical faith and Puritan work ethic and other things? And much of that came out of the teaching and theology of Edwards. And it left a lasting impression upon America that even to this day is still, you can still feel the impact.
Well, fascinating life, character, and leadership. And we'll leave links to the two biographies that you used we've talked about on today's show. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.